Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming down to the Cambridge Union this evening for our Week 8 debate with AstraZeneca. This house needs new drugs. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm sure it'll be really interesting. Just going to run through a few rules and ways that people can get involved. And please do this. It's more fun when everyone asks questions, and it's actually a big debate. So, if you'd like to ask a question during a speaker's speech, all you need to do is put your hand up and say point of information or on that point. You just do it by literally shouting it, basically. And then please wait for a microphone to come to you if the speaker says yes. The speaker is allowed to say no if they're running out of time. The second way you can get involved is that we do a thing called floor speeches. This happens between each set of speakers. There'll be 2 rounds of floor speeches, and I'll invite one of you to speak in proposition, one in opposition, and one in abstention of the motion, which basically means you think the motion is stupid, which you may do. If that happens, please say your name for the book and wait for a microphone to get to you. The best floor speech of this term wins a free bicycle. So that is definitely incentive if I've ever heard one. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to win that, but that's sad. But yeah, that's one thing, and I think that's all. So, without further ado, let's begin. This house needs new drugs. Our first speaker for the proposition, the CEO of AstraZeneca, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies and a constituent of the FTSE 100, is Pascal Soriot. Pascal, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, Cambridge Union Society members, ladies and gentlemen, this house and the world need new drugs. And I have to tell you, I'm actually dead scared that I may soon need a new drug myself. So this should actually not surprise anybody in this room that the CEO of a biopharmaceutical company would argue tonight that new drugs are needed to help patients with severe diseases, but also new policies that support investments in those new drugs. So let me just start by illustrating my point by asking you all to raise your hand if you have taken a drug in your life or if you know someone who has taken a drug. And by drug, I mean anything going from aspirin to one of those modern medicines. Well, thank you so much. Not everybody, actually, but there are lots of young faces in this room. I can tell you that as you get older, and I know very well, you not only would raise both of your hands, but it actually would become very desperate that someone would invent something for the many diseases you're starting to stare in the face as you get older. And of course, one of the notable ones is Alzheimer's disease, but there are many others. And one of these is called aging. And I was recently with one of the global experts in aging in San Francisco. And she actually told me there's no reason why we could not live 300 years old. So maybe someday, one day, someone is going to invent a new drug to treat aging and keep us alive 300 years. Too late for me, but for some of you, it may actually work. So from generics to targeted medicines, we actually need new drugs to help those patients who face terrible diseases. Not only to help physicians, also to help physicians do their job, because you all agree with me that a physician without medicines would actually be able to do a very precise diagnosis for a disease, but be very limited in their usefulness to a patient without a treatment. So today what I want to do to support the motion is make 3 points. The first one is today's innovative medicines are tomorrow's generics, and I'll explain what I mean by this. The second point I want to make is the emerging new drugs are precise and they are effective. And they are game-changing for patients. There's a new wave of tremendous new treatments that are coming. And the third is innovation that drives new drugs is risky, of course, but it also drives broader economic development and economic value creation. So let me start with my first point. And to illustrate this point that today's drugs are tomorrow's generic, I just want to share a personal story with you. I have a grandson who is 9 years old, and he lives in Australia. He's a typical Australian. He loves cricket. He's an outdoor sort of a young boy. He doesn't even speak French, I have to say, to my great despair. And when he was actually six months old, a long time ago, I was just by chance in Sydney because it was Christmas, and I go there every year. And he suddenly became ill, very ill, and had a lot of fever and didn't do very well. And we rushed to the hospital, and he had a severe cystitis. And he was treated by doctors, and he was discharged with, we all panicked, of course, as you can imagine. He was 6 months old, and he was perfect, and he still is perfect like all grandchildren. And he was discharged with a prescription of a product called Bactrim. And Bactrim is a very old antibiotic. And at the time, I was working for a company called Roche. And Roche invented Bactrim a long time ago. So I went to the pharmacist with this prescription, and I bought Bactrim, and the pharmacist asked me $4. And we gave him Bactrim, and his infection cleared. And I actually sat there and thought about it later on, and I thought, 70, 80 years ago, he would probably have developed a complicated cystitis, maybe a kidney infection. He might have died, or he might have remained handicapped for the rest of his life. And we saved his life for $4. And this product, Bactrim, was actually a generic at that point, and it was invented by Roche. It used to be very expensive at some point, and it became very free. And that's the whole story about pharmaceuticals and new medicines, is that at some point they look expensive. Companies have a limited period of time during which they can reward themselves and get rewarded for the risk they've taken, not only the investment they've made, but the enormous risk they take. And then with that, they get to a stage where the product becomes out of patent and it becomes free forever for the rest of human history. You can save lives for a very, very cheap price. And this is what will happen with many of the drugs that are today looking very expensive. You have to look at it over the long-term period. And those drugs that treat cancer today that look expensive will become free at some point. And we should always remember the impact that many of these medicines have had on medicine, on patients, and mortality. I'll give you a couple of examples. Cholesterol. My father died of a heart attack and a long time ago, and he had cholesterol and he was not very well controlled. There was no statin at the time. And today statins, they were introduced in the 90s, and today they are generic again. In the last 30 years, cardiovascular mortality has been reduced in half. And it's been reduced in half even though obesity has been on the rise. Why? Because diseases like hypertension or cholesterol are much better treated. Much better treated. And you know what it costs? It costs $3. It costs pennies a day, about $3 a month, less than a coffee. For less than the price of a coffee, you can keep people from having a heart attack for the rest of their life. And there are countries that don't actually get to the stage where they can actually benefit from this. If you look at Russia, in Russia, people are not so well treated. And if in Russia cardiovascular death was similar to what it is in Sweden, 500,000, 500,000 people who die every year would not die. And all of this for a very, very inexpensive price. So this is the kind of example that drugs can actually bring to patients. The same will be true of cancer, provided societies accept to pay a certain price that reward the innovation. And not all countries do that. And the UK is a case in point as far as cancer. And as a result of it, cancer mortality in the UK is higher than in the rest of the world. If I take lung cancer as an example, the 5-year survival rate, which is the percentage of patients who have, for instance, lung cancer and are still alive at the end of 5 years, is 8% in the UK. 8% of patients with lung cancer are alive at 5 years. In Europe, it's 15% on average, or 14%. In the US, it's 15%. In Europe, only Bulgaria does worse than the UK. France and Germany are around 14%. And it is because access to these life-saving medicines is not good enough, and it's only going to get worse as new treatments like immunotherapies get introduced. So that closes my first point. My second point is that scientific advances are such that they are transforming patient care, and we are entering a new era. And at AstraZeneca, we invest in science, and we are here in Cambridge to collaborate and work with some of the best scientists in the world to progress this science. And one of the things we do is focus on precision medicine, because the future of medicine is very much in developing drugs that target the right patient, find the patient who will benefit without being exposed to side effects. And the benefit of this is that, first of all, it improves the productivity of the industry. You develop drugs much faster. Secondly, you don't expose patients who would not benefit from a drug. You don't expose them to side effects. Thirdly, make your drug more cost-effective and therefore easier for payers to cover. So this is really the second point. And the third point I want to leave you with is that medical advance is risky. The kind of industry we are in is very risky. But it also creates enormous innovation and economic growth for those countries that are able to invest in it. And what I mean by risky is that we invest hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes to find nothing, to have a product that fails in our hands. So the risk investors and shareholders take is enormous and has to be rewarded. On the other hand, the life sciences sector is generating enormous economic growth. In the UK, for instance, we, together with GSK, invest £3.4 billion in R&D every year. In fact, we invest a larger share of that spend. We are the number one private investor in R&D in the UK. And all of this has led us, with great collaborations, to become one of the leading companies in the world in terms of the science we produce. We track, for instance, the kind of publications we have in top medical journals. 5 years ago, we had about 10 publications in some of those top journals. Today, we have 82. We publish about 1,100 publications a year in total, but we track the best of the best. And this is increasing rapidly, and this is really thanks to the great people we are employing, but also the collaborations we have with Cambridge. We had less than 10 collaborations 5 years ago. We have about 130 collaborations with the university today. There are 15,000 people who work in life sciences in direct jobs in the Cambridge so-called biosciences clusters, and many more in indirect jobs. So through this, we create enormous economic value here in Cambridge, but also potentially for the UK. And as you know, the government has been positioning life sciences as a critical part of the economic strategy for the country in the future. So let me just come to my conclusion. And my conclusion is, I just want to leave you with this thought. The importance of new medicines become really real to each of us when we are the reason, when we become the patient. And I hope none of you become a patient one day. But I tell you, when you meet patients, you immediately realize that the importance of new medicines become paramount to you if you are the patient. And I've met many patients who have benefited from some of our recent new innovative medicines. And many of those are very emotional. They cry. Sometimes they thank us, and it's something that really makes our life it makes us even more committed, inspired and more committed to come up with new medicines. And in the recent past, in the last couple of years, we've introduced 2 new treatments for lung cancers, for cancer types that had no options before, no solutions, no treatment. People were just simply dying, and those 2 medicines are making enormous difference. We've introduced a medicine for ovarian cancer. We are in the process of introducing a product for severe asthma, and people think asthma is not a severe disease, but it is actually. And people who have severe asthma end up with severe exacerbations that take them to hospital. Sometimes they die, but even if they don't die, their life is a misery. They take high dose of corticosteroids, they gain weight, they have many side effects. We've just introduced a new product that helps those patients reduce the dose of steroids and control their disease. So that makes us all proud in our company and makes me very proud of the team that is coming up with all these medicines. And tonight I'm very fortunate to have some of them with me. And as a close, I will have to admit that I'm making the assumption here that we all agree that living longer is actually a good thing for all of us and for society. But if you assume, which is a possibility, if you assume that older people, and I hope you don't because I'm soon going to be one of those, actually are better off being sent on an iceberg by themselves on the sea and rid of, then of course my point is moot tonight. But if together with me, if like me, you believe that living longer and better lives is good for each of us and is good for society, I urge you to vote that this House needs new drug. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues' points.
Pascal, thank you very much for your speech. We'll now move to the first speaker on the opposition, who is Dr. Aseem Malhotra, a cardiologist and noted critic of overdiagnosis. He's also a spokesman for the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. Aseem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen. It was one of the founding fathers of the evidence-based medicine movement, Professor David Sackett, who once said, 50% of what you learn in medical school will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation. The trouble is, you don't know which half, so you have to learn on your own. I've been a qualified doctor and now a consultant cardiologist for almost 2 decades. But I have learnt and slowly and reluctantly come to the conclusion that honest doctors can no longer practice honest medicine. Corporate greed and systematic political failure has brought the NHS to its knees. We have a complete healthcare system failure and an epidemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed patients, based upon a number of factors. Biased funding of research. So that's research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals. Biased reporting in the media. Commercial conflicts of interest. And last but not least, medical doctors' inability to understand and communicate health statistics. The situation of over-medication has become so dire that one respected Cochrane collaboration researcher, Peter Gosha, has estimated that prescribed medications are the 3rd most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer. How did I come to all of this awareness? I'm a frontline doctor. I don't do original research. I just want to do what's best for my patients. In the summer of 2010, while working as a cardiology SPR doing interventional cardiology, at 3 in the morning, I treated a patient with emergency keyhole heart surgery, stenting, in the middle of the night. He did well, he survived, and that was great, a great treatment. This person was saved by modern medicine. The next day on the ward round, I'm trying to talk to him about taking his medications. Statin drug was one of those medications, aspirin. We're giving him a cocktail of drugs, life-saving drugs, we believe. And I'm also talking to him about the fact that he needs to stop smoking and follow a healthy lifestyle and eat healthy food. And as I'm telling him about eating healthy food, he gets served a burger and chips by the hospital. And he looks at me and says, "Doc, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle if you're serving me, pardon my language, the same crap that brought me here in the first place?" And it really got me thinking about how we got to a situation where in 2004, the World Health Organization declares obesity a global epidemic. Where we are now, we have more than 60% of the adult UK population overweight or obese. 1 in 3 children, by the time they leave primary school, are in the same category, and these trends are getting worse. We cannot drug people into being healthier. The real challenge we have in healthcare at the moment is lifestyle-related disease. Poor diet contributes, according to the Lancet Global of Disease reports, to more disease and death than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined. Now, statins were mentioned, life-saving drugs, but what does that actually mean? Well, the reality is this, and I have prescribed statins to thousands of patients in my career, like Smarties. I've even started statins in A&E when a patient comes in with a heart attack, because I believed and trusted the literature. But when you look at the data, when you look at statins in secondary prevention in people with heart disease, and this is a selected group from industry-sponsored trials, the median increase in life expectancy, according to a publication in the BMJ in 2015, the median increase in life expectancy for people taking a statin every day for 5 years in the trial was 4.2 days. Another analysis showed, we talk about reduction in cardiovascular mortality in the population. Most of the decline in cardiovascular mortality in the last 30 years has happened because of smoking reduction. Modern medicine has had a role, especially in acute treatments. But interestingly, an analysis showed in Western Europe, for secondary prevention, statins did not reduce cardiovascular mortality. Now, one of the reasons to understand that is because in the community, and this is before any media hype or potential scaremongering, 75% of statin users will stop taking a statin within a year. Most of those people said it's because of side effects. So really, the real issue is also understanding how reliable is the data that we have. Professor John Wanidis, professor of medicine and statistics in Stanford University, recently did an analysis of 60,000 clinical studies and concluded only 7% of those studies fulfill criteria for being high quality and relevant to patients. You talk about innovation. We have an innovation crisis, and part of that reason is because of the system is geared towards commercial interests, not that of patients. Of the 667 drugs approved by the FDA between 2000 and 2008, only 11% of them were actually found to be truly innovative. 89 were essentially had no therapeutic benefit over previous drugs. And as I'm sure my colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry here know, they have a legal, a fiduciary obligation to produce profit for their shareholders. They do not, although we'd like it to be the case, they do not have a legal obligation to sell as the best treatment. They spend twice as much on marketing as much as they do on research and development. No wonder we can't produce new, good, and innovative drugs. But with the healthcare crisis that we have, the lifestyle-related diseases that we have 50% of people over the age of 70 who are on 3 medications. Life expectancy increase, very good point you mentioned here. Absolutely, medicine has had a role, but it's very minor compared to other things. So we've added about 100 years to our life expectancy since 1900. We've added about 30 years, since 1900. 100 years is a lot. 30 years. 25 of those years have come about because of safer work environments, better sanitation, clean drinking water, seatbelts in cars, smoke-free buildings, antibiotics for infections, yes, vaccinations, yes. But actually, and acute treatments, but actually most of what we're trying to deal with right now in the modern era is dealing with chronic disease, which is related to lifestyle, and that is not going to be counted with drugs that have very marginal benefits at best and come with significant side effects. So really, we need better drugs. I agree. We don't need more drugs. We need better drugs. And I believe in the next few years, we need a national campaign to reduce the amount of medications people are taking, and we need to push for healthier lifestyles, and we need to be more transparent with patients, and then we can have better accountability, better transparency, and better quality of care that's lacking in our health service at the moment. Thank you.
Azim, thank you very much for your speech. We're now going to open up to the floor and see what other people think. If anyone would like to make a speech in proposition of the motion, this house needs new drugs. It needs to be a couple of, it can be 5 seconds, it doesn't really matter. Please put your hand up. Anybody? Yeah.
Hello. I'm not actually judging, if that's what you're wondering, so I'm impartial. I think what's interesting is that although we've heard, and I agree that the system is biased in some way, that it's geared, although we haven't yet heard a mechanism for which that is the case. We've just heard examples and statistics on how that might be evidence. We haven't seen the mechanism of how that goes through, is what the alternative might be. So sure, maybe our system is biased, and maybe the drug companies, and it's absolutely the case that they do actually, are geared towards profit. But what is it if we replace them? Well, if we replace them, we have to start funding an entire drug program. We then have to ensure that's unbiased in some way. We're going to face political corruption and all the other side of it. So I think this house does need new drugs, and the way to go about it is absolutely in the way that we're doing with a sort of free market ideal. It's biased. We need reform, of course. Legislation helps it. But the alternative is to self-fund an entire pharmaceutical industry, one of the most expensive industries out there. So I would therefore beg everyone to vote in favour of the motion. Thank you.
Would anyone like to speak in opposition of the motion? Yes, at the back. Can we get a microphone there, please? Thank you.
Henry, Homerton College. So, as a caveat before I begin, I'd like to state that I'm not a medic, I'm not a medical student. Indeed, I can't say Dr. Right, although it would make a good joke, I think. I'm a computer scientist, and so because this matter's a bit more analog than I'm used to, you'll have to forgive any mistakes if I make them. This has been the first union debate where a speaker has genuinely changed my mind on an issue. And surprisingly, it took both the proposition and the opposition speaker to make me support the opposition this evening. The question and the point raised by the person who made a floor speech for the proposition was a valid one. What do we replace this with if we're publicly funding research? But it's made me think, how much money are we spending on aid to third world countries, where there are many diseases where no money is being spent on research simply because it is not profitable? Surely this aid money we're spending, and we spend a lot of money on aid, and we should continue to do so because it's a great thing to do. Why can we not spend this on research into these vaccines and these drugs which would save more lives? If we need new drugs, how are the drugs companies, including his own company, going to engage with the NHS to ensure they can be accessible to all people? The reason the UK currently doesn't fund these expensive drugs is because they are extortionately expensive, and the UK considers it to be a good thing to fund healthcare for everybody based on need, not what they can pay for. Secondly, if we need these new drugs in the world, these drugs for third world countries, why do they get almost no funding when all this money is going on marketing? And the free market is doing a good job at developing new drugs. And I don't doubt that. But these drugs aren't for all people. So my question to the proposition tonight is, who needs new drugs? Do we need new drugs, as the motion says? Or do the rich need new drugs, which is what's happening at the moment? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anyone like to speak in abstention of the motion? We've got at the top. Yes. Is there a microphone upstairs?
Thank you. Tell me you know who I am. Just a kind of response to both of those. I want to pick up on what Chet said, that I'm pretty sure the biggest client of the pharmaceutical companies in the UK is the NHS, and the NHS is funded by tax, and therefore, well, actually, we kind of already do fund the pharmaceutical companies. And this is quite an interesting debate in terms of economics. I am a Natsky, so I don't really understand economics. It's all just a black box to me. But what is interesting is that these pharmaceutical companies, while they do profit from taxes, they also are prepared to take on a level of risk and debt, which I'm not sure the public would. So this is just kind of a response to Chet, but also I'm going to sit on the fence because I quite like Chet. But actually, because the facts are kind of, it's not just simply that the pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money and it's great and they profit and we can never fund it, because we do basically fund it, especially in this country, but it's the amount of risk that they're prepared to take and the investors who are also prepared to invest in them and take on that risk. And we need that kind of risk to allow innovation to continue, because science is bloody hard and it takes a lot of time and money. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to do one more round of floor speeches after the next few speakers. So we'll just go back to the main debate and to the proposition. Our second speaker for the proposition is Baroness Deleth Morgan, the CEO of Breast Cancer Now and a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Deleth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. President, Cambridge Union Society, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be invited to come and contribute to this debate. It's already kicked off in a really interesting way. And I'm thinking about what I can really contribute to this debate. And I'm really coming at this from the point of view as the chief executive of what in effect is the largest breast cancer charity in the UK. We fund independent academic research. The money that we use to fund this research is raised mainly by people affected by breast cancer. And so we are also very concerned to see the innovations that we and others bring about put to the benefit of patients. And so we're very involved in campaigning on policy issues. And I suppose I feel compelled then to argue for the proposition and to make a few key points, I hope, in favour of that proposition that this House needs new drugs. I was racking my brains to think of a student union joke about drugs or something like that, and I couldn't come up with a good one, so I'm sure somebody else will at a better stage. So I'm going to approach this very much from the perspective of patients, so people affected by breast cancer, many of whom actually are extremely well informed and are patient advocates and work very closely with the scientific community. And I'm going to use breast cancer as an example. It's what I know most about, but also I would argue that my points do have read across to other cancers and to other conditions, particularly life-limiting long-term conditions. So breast cancer, as I'm sure most of you know, it's a very, very difficult disease to cope with. As breast cancer now, our vision is quite simple and ambitious. We believe that if we all act now, then by 2050, we hope that everyone who develops breast cancer will live and live well. Now, breast cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in the UK. The chances are that everyone in this room will be affected by breast cancer at some point in our lives, whether you're diagnosed with it or a family member develops breast cancer or a colleague or friend is diagnosed. And yes, men can get breast cancer too, although it is quite rare. That diagnosis of breast cancer will have a devastating impact on the person diagnosed, but also those around them. And the good news, and I don't want to be too negative about all this, the good news is that thanks to the advances in diagnosis and treatment of breast cancer, the percentage of people surviving breast cancer has doubled in the last 40 years. And while the opposition might say that, okay, job done, we don't need any more drugs, my argument is that that is far from the case. Drugs are a core component of treatment, and the new types of drugs, such as Herceptin and tamoxifen, have played a huge part in ensuring that progress and allowing many, many years of extra life to be lived. But there is so much more to do. There's so much more to finish the job. Every 45 minutes in the UK, someone will die of breast cancer, and around about 2 people will die tonight during the course of this debate because of the disease. And almost all of these deaths result in metastatic breast cancer, where the disease has spread from the breast to other parts of the body and become incurable. And the average life expectancy for someone with metastatic breast cancer is between 2 and 3 years. So I would argue that because of more new drugs that have become available in the last few years, which can significantly extend the lives of some patients with certain types of metastatic breast cancer, we're starting to see a much better future for people living with incurable cancer. We're starting to see... Yes? Sure.
Surely, by extension, research and development should take place for early warning and spotting the cancer early, as
Absolutely, yeah.
as well as purely development into drugs for stage 3 or stage 4 cancers.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And in fact, some of the drugs that were identified first for treatment in advanced disease settings later have been shown to be really useful in prevention. So, it's all part of the same big challenge. So these new drugs that are now becoming very helpful with metastatic breast cancer, some of them have less severe side effects, as Pascal has already talked about. And this means that patients are able to spend quality time with their loved ones and carry on life as normal, which is amazing to think that people living with terminal disease to do this. And perhaps the best way to explain how much these new drugs mean to patients is to use their own words. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So Vicky Orvis, who is 55 and a sports writer from St Albans, says of the new drug palbociclib, "This fantastic drug gave me 2 years without my cancer progressing, with minimum side effects. It allowed me to continue working full-time at a national newspaper, even covering the Olympics in Rio, and to lead a relatively normal life." And that is so valuable. So Bonnie Fox, another one of our patient advocates, who's 40 and from Croydon. She was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer when her son was just 4 months old. And she says about the drug Progetta that she's on, "I owe so much to this fantastic drug, which has kept my cancer stable and has kept me feeling incredibly well for almost 2.5 years now. I will never be free of breast cancer, but it has enabled me to live a relatively normal life, to work, to travel, and to continue being a busy mum, which means everything to me." So, despite the very real progress that we've seen with these amazing new drugs, keeping Bonnie alive, we still lose 11,000 lives to breast cancer every year. And that's in the UK. And that's because even with the new drugs coming through, we do start to see resistance developing, and eventually the disease wins. So I would support the motion emphatically. We need more new drugs who can deal with resistance when it occurs. We need more and better options. And we still need people who have rarer cancers, who have more aggressive types of breast cancer. We need new drugs who can add, where we can add to the chemotherapy, which is their only option at the moment, and which can have such grueling side effects that we've already heard about. We still need the breakthroughs that will turn metastatic breast cancer and other cancers from a terminal condition to a long-term condition that will allow them to live life to the full. So maybe it will be one or more of the scientists of the future in this room tonight that will discover the breakthroughs that will help breast cancer now achieve our vision. The opposition may say that new drugs are all very well, but what's the point? They don't always get to the patients. They don't get to the patients that need them. And to some extent, I would say there is a real concern there. We know that uptake of new cancer drugs in the UK is slower. We've already heard about that than our closest European neighbours. We need to speed up the process that determines whether new drugs will be available on the NHS. And all too often, patients have a long and anxious wait to discover whether they will be available and accessible to them. So it is time that we have a better, more flexible system that doesn't leave the UK behind. And the opposition may also argue that new drugs are too expensive. And so let's be clear. New drugs must be priced fairly and affordably for the NHS and the taxpayer. That's absolutely essential. And we're told that companies are increasingly offering discounts so that new cancer drugs can be made available on the NHS, which is absolutely essential if we're to see new and innovative treatments coming through. The government's efforts, though, to secure the future of the life sciences industry and the up-and-coming negotiations on a new deal on pricing regulation for medicines and on the issues around Brexit really do provide a crucial opportunity to address some of these price issues. And patients cannot afford for this opportunity to be missed. So the shadow of Brexit really does loom large, and the government must ensure that there is no disruption or delay in medicines being made available in this country. It must also ensure that we are able to continue to shape and participate in future EU research programmes, and that patients in the UK can take part in clinical trials of new drugs and have access to that innovation, and that the UK, which we know has been thought of as a global centre of excellence for clinical research, should continue to really offer that to patients and the benefits that brings through. And again, the opposition may argue that prevention is better than cure. And that's a great line. But let's be absolutely clear that there are many women, so about 15% of women that develop breast cancer have a significant family history of the disease, and 5% have an inherited fault in a gene, you know, the Angelina Jolie gene, the BRCA gene. You can be absolutely clear that for these women, they could be doing absolutely everything right, eating a healthy diet, taking regular exercise, following all the advice, but still develop cancer. So prevention cannot be everything. And it's worth remembering that some people have suggested that around about 50% of all cancers are sporadic or random events. So you could do absolutely everything right and still develop cancer. So in conclusion, I would like to be absolutely clear that from a patient perspective, I think it's a no-brainer. You know, we are still seeing far too many people dying prematurely of cancer and other life-limiting and life-shortening diseases. And the drugs that we have, although there's some great work going on looking at repurposing, and that's a whole other discussion, but there's so much more that could be done to improve the quality of life and the length of life for patients in the UK. So please support the proposition. This House does need new drugs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delith. We'll now move right to the opposition. Our second speaker of this evening is Richard Smith, the former editor of the British Medical Journal and former CEO of the BMJ Group. Richard, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, comrades, let me start with a question. How many people here would like to live 300 years? Hardly anybody. And if you do, I hope you're in not sans eyes, sans teeth, sans everything, which is the way it tends to be at the moment. I'd like to point out before I begin my main points, most of what Pascal said was about old drugs. It wasn't about new drugs. And Della quoted tamoxifen, which I believe is some 40 years old. So, there are a lot of good drugs out there, and we're not disputing that. The question is, let's do something more intelligent now than spend a lot of resources inventing new drugs, because unfortunately it's getting tougher and tougher and tougher and more expensive to invent new drugs, and a lot of them are extremely expensive and add almost no value. And I'd like to point out as well that Pascal's argument about providing employment, no doubt attractive to scientists in Cambridge, of course the same argument is used by tobacco companies. You can kill people and employ and provide employment at the same time. Before I get to my main points, I want to point out that a lot of what pharmaceutical companies are doing now, because it's got so difficult to invent drugs, they've started inventing diseases, like female sexual dysfunction, or baldness. I don't think this is a disease. Or shyness. They're very good at inventing diseases, because actually the marketing people are great at that, and it's easier than coming up with new drugs. But my main point, which my honourable friend at the back there pointed out, is that of the 7 billion people in the world, 2 billion get virtually no medical care whatsoever. This is where we should be giving them old drugs, not wasting our time inventing new drugs. Take the example of coronary artery disease. My friend here is a cardiologist, and so as not to be controversial, I'm talking about people who have already got heart disease or stroke. It's established. There is no disputing whatsoever that those people should get aspirin, they should get a statin, they should get probably 2 or 3 antihypertensive drugs. What proportion of the people in low-income countries do you think get those 5 drugs? Give me an answer. 20? Far too high. It's 2. That's about right. 4%. And actually, even in this country, roughly only 30%, even in the US, actually get all of these treatments. When I was at medical school, I graduated in 1976, I learnt the rule of halves, which applies to almost all chronic diseases. That half of the people, so let's use diabetes as an example, of all the people who've got diabetes, only about half know that they've got diabetes. Of the half that have got diabetes, only about half are treated, and of the half that are treated, only about half are treated adequately. So there is huge unmet need out there that we could meet today because those drugs are extremely cheap, they're off patent. We don't need new drugs. We need to put our energy into getting those drugs that we know work. We have very solid evidence to those people who need them, not only in other countries, but in this country. The problem is that new drugs, hugely expensive, particularly with personalized medicine, which I suggest is largely a fantasy of geneticists, they're getting more and more expensive. New drugs create new divisions because those drugs will not be available to people. Then I'd also point out that actually, if we combine these drugs into one polypill, I've been an enthusiast for a polypill, my friend here doesn't believe in that, but if you put those drugs that I mentioned, the aspirin, the antihypertensive, the statin, into one drug, and you let people take it, then it will prevent about half to three-quarters of heart attacks and stroke. No matter how genius they are at AstraZeneca, they will never be able to invent a drug that is as powerful as that, unless Pascal convinced me otherwise, but I think that's not the case. So again, we can use old drugs more effectively. And then I want to say something, I have to, as you expect, about the cost of drugs. But also that a lot of the drugs that are coming available are just no bloody good. So a study of 48 new drugs for cancer approved for use in Europe between 2009 and 2013, they estimated that 3.3 years after they were on the market, so this is not just a matter of being slow, that actually there was no evidence that they extended life for most cancer indications. And when there were survival gains over existing treatment options or placebos, they were often marginal. They also made the point in this study that cytotoxic chemotherapy has done little or nothing to extend the life of people with cancer. The reason that people are living longer with cancer is because of all sorts of other reasons. And some of these drugs are unbelievably expensive. The cost per QALY, you've heard of QALYs, quality adjusted life year, that's what NICE uses to decide whether a drug should be made available on the market. Well, they usually have a limit of about £30,000 per QALY. But some of these drugs are costing £800,000 a QALY. And one of the reasons for that is that they're extending life by literally only weeks or months, not by years, as obviously people hope. And I sat next recently to a ghoulish oncologist at a dinner who said, we now have to do our clinical trials with stopwatches because the amount of gain in life is so small. So these drugs are costing us a ton of money, these attempts to produce new drugs and producing almost no benefit. So the financial cost is high, but to follow on from my esteemed friend, the opportunity cost is even higher. What proportion of health do you think is down to health care? Someone give me an answer? 50%? 5 times too high. It's 10%. 30% of health is genes, 30% is environment, and 30% is lifestyle. Healthcare does not really extend life very much. It's about, reducing symptoms, perhaps. And yet, by spending more and more money on these new drugs, we're slowly but surely bankrupting the NHS and other health systems for almost no gain. We have an obsession with magic bullets. Please do. You look like a student.
I'm Patrick Maxwell. I accept that drugs are expensive, but it is not what is bankrupting the NHS because it is only about 11% of the NHS budget.
Yeah, but it's a part that's kind of tending to go up and up and up, and particularly because a lot of the expenditures are on the end of life care. But it's contributing. Okay, I'll give you that point. It's contributing to the bankrupting of the... Please, another student.
We're busy here today. Alistair Allen. 10% of health is related to health care for the population, but for an ill person, healthcare must contribute more than 10%.
Yeah, but I'm talking about populations. And as you can see, I'm trying to make the point that we're spending lots of money, often extending people's lives and actually living a very low quality of life for very small benefit, when we could be doing enormous good with much cheaper drugs, getting them much more available.
But drugs are for ill people.
I'm an eternal student before you comment on my age, and I look much older than I am. So I was here at Sydney 25 years ago, and I'm now a fellow at Lucy Cavendish College. Just want to say, I find it outrageous that anyone would comment on extending anyone's life, and I'd like to go back to Pascal's point, which is the cost of the drugs will become personal when it hits you or somebody you love. And I really would like to ask you a question, which is, how can you sit next to Dr. Malhotra, who in his esteemed speech was blaming people in the BMJ for the misinformation of his youth and of his colleagues? So,
we're coming at the argument in slightly different ways. I think that, unfortunately, if we look at a lot of the extension of life, the point I'm making, these drugs, A, they're not actually extending life by very much. In the few people they are, they're doing it often with horrible side effects, so the quality of life is hardly any better. You remember there's a famous study that they had a whole group of people who were being treated, and some of them opted for palliative care, and actually the people who opted for palliative care lived longer. We would be wrong, I think, to having these poisonous drugs necessarily makes you live longer. That was a very famous study published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Please.
It was a very famous paper, and actually the paper compared standard of care with standard of care plus good palliative care. So it was addition of palliative care, not palliative care versus standard care. So
no, I don't agree. I think they stopped curative care. There was no attempt to cure these people, which there had been before. No. Well, we'll consult a librarian and they'll bring the paper to us. So I was making the point that the opportunity cost of spending all this money on these drugs is absolutely huge. We should be spending the money on education, housing, the environment, reducing poverty. We shouldn't even be spending the money on the NHS. The NHS is carrying a huge opportunity cost for other things that are actually far more effective for health. So let me end by saying there are no drugs for health. There are no drugs for health. Health is about staying as far away from drugs as you possibly can, including tobacco and alcohol. And I look forward to discussing that in the bar later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We'll do one final round of floor speeches. Would anyone like to speak in proposition? Yes, you can.
Also a student, yeah. Actually a member of the Union Society. I've spoken here on many occasions. So first of all, there's a fallacy here. The fallacy is we should be spending on this versus this. We should be doing healthcare or education, right? It's one or the other. This is a fallacy. We should, of course, be doing both. The question, can we afford both? But we should be doing both. The second point in all of this is this motion is not the pharmaceutical industry is a bad industry. It's not. The pharmaceutical industry is not the right people to discover drugs. The drugs are too expensive. It's this house needs new drugs. It doesn't say where they come from. It just turns out the only model that's been successful is the pharmaceutical industry. I'm a Darwinian. I would love a world where there was a diversity of routes to come up with new cures. Actually, there is. But it turns out that the pharmaceutical industry is the most efficient at generating those. The question was, who needs new drugs? My son-in-law has Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. He is 21. He will die within the next 2 years. He is not a lifestyle challenge of statins versus a poly pill. Right? He has an incurable disease that will kill him and he has cost the health system a huge amount of money. And the potential for new treatments for those sorts of diseases are real. Would you sit there and say, so he will die, but would you sit there and say to parents who have just had a diagnosis of their son of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, we should not seek new drugs which could make a distant difference to your son in 5-10 years' time? I say no. I remember the 1980s. I remember AIDS. I remember people who've died of AIDS. It was a lifestyle disease, sure. You could sit there and say it's a lifestyle problem, yeah? Which of course it was to an extent or other. And what was it that has turned AIDS into something which we've been able to manage with lifestyle? It was the pharmaceutical industry. It was new drugs. AIDS will come again, other drugs will come again, new diseases will come. The gentleman over there was absolutely right when he talks about the thing that changes the dial in cancer is early detection. The reason it changes the dial in early detection is that surgery works, but also the drugs work better. Now turn to me and talk to someone with Alzheimer's, dementia. We know the thing that changes the dial in dementia and Alzheimer's is actually early detection, but there's no cure. The reason it changes the dial is because if we detect early, we have a chance of developing drugs, and that will change things. So it is not an either-or, it's both. And I would say, looking at those people, and yes, the cost is important, but NICE has just approved a drug at hundreds of thousands of pounds, right, for a treatment. Why? Because it is a cure. It's not a lifestyle disease with 4 or 5 days or years or whatever. It is a cure. And the possibility going forward of new drugs and precision medicine and molecular targeting is about cures, as well as, yes, using the existing drugs better, as well as early diagnosis and surgery, as well as prevention. It's not an either-or, it's both. I approve this motion.
Thank you very much. Would anyone like to speak in opposition of the motion? Yes, you're first, yeah.
I'd like to bring up an example which I don't think has been touched on about the use of existing drugs versus introduction of new drugs. And the example that I want to bring up is antibiotic resistance. We have many, many antibiotics currently, but we're seeing the onset of many bacteria that are becoming increasingly resistant. And the reason for this isn't that we don't have enough new drugs to be using, although that would help, of course, but the reason is, and the root is, inappropriate prescription, overuse of these antibiotics to a certain extent. And I think that could help much more than spending all the money and the effort into developing new drugs. Perhaps we could also, perhaps in this case, it's more relevant to address how we use the current existing drugs than needing new drugs.
Thank you. And finally, would anyone like to make a point in abstention? Yes.
I would like to make a short point about where new drugs actually come from. If we think about how pharmaceutical industry conducts research into new drugs, that is mostly based on science that's 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I do believe that fundamental research conducted at universities and not at pharmaceutical companies is actually what we need to combat the diseases we have with new approaches, because the approaches we have good drugs for that, but we do need new approaches. I think that personalized medicine could be a potential way to increase the efficiency of drugs and the drug use on a patient because of less side effects. But I do believe it's important for that, especially for those new ways of treatment, to also invest a lot into fundamental research into those topics and not just talk about the research conducted in pharmaceutical companies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The discussion will continue afterwards in the bar, as Richard said. So if you have spoken this evening, feel free to join us afterwards. And if you'd like to speak to anyone afterwards, then some of us will be hanging around. But thank you very much for getting involved so far. We now will return to the main debate. Our third speaker for the proposition is Steve Bates, the CEO of the Bioindustry Association.
Mr. President, members, thank you very much for the invite. And I'm going to try and respond to some of the points that have been made from the floor. So if my contribution is less structured than I'd initially planned, that's the reason. So I did a little bit of research in your excellent library upstairs before coming down here. And I see that in 1978, the second debate of the Michaelmas term was this House would legalise cannabis. It was debated, and the future Archbishop of Canterbury was in your seats over there. And in my seat, closing for the A's, was Dr. Colin Phipps, the Labour MP for Dudley West from 1974 to 79. Not a big figure that everyone remembers, but if you get the chance to see this House, which is touring to Cambridge, he'd be a sort of backstage figure in that excellent play that's coming. But I'm sure he would be delighted to learn that it's a British biotech company, GW Pharma, that from the 90s has pioneered cannabinoid formulations as therapeutics to a global market, making safe, creating new drugs, as well as jobs in the UK, legalising cannabis for patients in a safe and effective manner. I'm going to try and give you 5 reasons why I want you to support the motion, but I'm also going to try and pick up on some of the points that you've made. You so made the point about the need for access to third world drugs. I would agree with you that AIDS drugs didn't get to people in South Africa in the first flush of their invention, but I think there is an effective way in which they are reaching many parts of the third world. The real challenge there is an effective health system to work with that. And we need to work with governments in countries that don't have an established NHS, where there isn't access to basic healthcare infrastructure to make that happen, as well as having therapeutics that can work when you need them. You made the point about antibiotic resistance, and I'll take that head on. You're right, the challenge to human health aren't static. It's not just there's an elegant dance between what's used to tackle bacterial infection and the bacteria themselves. They evolve, they change. And I want you to be able to continue working, to continue doing your stents. In order to do your stents, you've got to be sure that there is something that can cope with, with the challenges that can go with surgery and interventions. And that is an evolving world of battling biomes. We need to make sure that we are staying on top of that and having new therapies. That's why we need new drugs, because the world is changing. We live in an ecosystem where things change and move. There are dynamics both in existing diseases and in new challenges to us. Andy made the point better than I can about Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I was going to touch on that. But if you look at other drugs, I would say that other disease areas, cystic fibrosis is a disease area which in my lifetime, I remember going to meet with that community when I was shortly after I left university. And the life expectancy then was into the early 20s. Now with some significant new drugs, for certain people with certain types of cystic fibrosis, that's well into the 40s and making a real difference. We've still got the challenge of Alzheimer's and others. One of the reasons why we need new drugs is because this city keeps discovering new stuff. If you stop discovering stuff about the genome and how things are changing, then we wouldn't have the challenge that what we know at the moment isn't quite working properly. So you're causing us the need, because you're leading the global understanding of biology, how our bodies work, age and go wrong. And that leads to new insights, which makes us realize that we need to do some things differently. Some things we realize work better than we thought, some things don't work as well as we thought, and then there's a load of bright people who can apply that knowledge to try and change things.
Point
An example
of
that,
information.
please.
Hello. I would like to address the point that you made about challenges and insights that you gain through new drugs. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but in my former university, I'm a neuroscience student, a master's student. It was very popular among students to take a specific drug. And specifically, it was Ritalin. It would speed up the performance. It would keep students awake. Mostly, they would reach out to it during very intensive periods. And it was something everybody knew, but nobody would talk about. So my question to you is, are you aware of this challenge? And if so, How do you think we can address this? Isn't this rather a question of, no, we don't need new drugs, but we need better drug education and more regulated drug policies so that you cannot just get Ritalin and all these other stimulants that quickly, which basically just mess up with the mental health of all students.
Thank you. Can I ask, happy to address the point. Can I ask, which university were you at previously?
It's in the Netherlands.
So is it as easy to get Ritalin here as it was in the Netherlands? And is it,
I would leave this question to my fellow friends.
Is it prescribed legally, or is it?
Of course, it is prescribed legally.
And it's got as a legal.
Masses of people are diagnosed, fake diagnosed with ADHD. It's very easy to get Ritalin. So I think it's not just a phenomenon in the Netherlands. It's a phenomenon in the United States. It's a phenomenon probably in this country as well. It's when you're in a high-achieving environment, this is what people turn to. They reach out to performance enhancers and the likes. So this is a challenge, and this is because these things are very easily available and very widespread. So as drug developers and people in charge of these means, you have a social responsibility, in my opinion, to address this challenge and to help improve this problem.
So thank you, and I accept the challenge. I think we see probably in every generation of students, people who want to experiment, expand their minds, think differently about things. In my generation, it was a different drug. It was MDMA, and I'm sure for people who are in different cohorts, you'll find students experimenting or looking to either expand their minds or think differently with different types of drugs. I think the responsibility for any vet developer is to ensure, and licensed therapies are licensed for particular conditions. And I look to my doctor colleagues here about the methods by which these are prescribed. There is a responsibility on doctors to ensure that the right patient goes to the right drug goes to the right patient at the right time in the right dose. And we can play our part by making sure that they are legally regulated. That's what we spend our time and effort doing, to make sure that these are consistent, coherent, and legal. And there is a responsibility on the healthcare system to ensure that they are distributed through pharmacy in a correct and appropriate way. And I would encourage everybody to do that. And that's what we would play our part in to do that. If I can, I'm just going to make a couple more points before finishing. The jobs point. I think the jobs point is important, and I don't think it's the same as the tobacco industry. This is an industry that delivers benefit for society, not just in terms of the scientists we need, but you've talked about the need for a regulated environment. We need regulators, we need judges. Intellectual property is a major industry in the UK, and ensuring that we've got jobs for patent attorneys, ethicists, patients, entrepreneurs, and other sectors is vital. So I'd encourage you to say, what is created by the drive for new drugs? It's not just the therapies themselves. It is also a whole ecosystem of creative people who are driving towards what I believe is a societal good. My closing point is I think that this is the scientific opportunity of our age. If you just move outside of here, go a few miles to the business parks, the labs that are around here, whether it be the genome campus, and I don't think it's fair to call some of the genetics things a fantasy of genetics. If you look at what's going on at Hinxton, they really are driving a fundamental difference in the understanding of human biology. I think that this is what the 21st century is going to be defined by. This is the combination of the ability to look inside at a molecular level the body with the power of significant computing power to analyze that through the genome is making a fundamental difference. And if we pass this up, this is a loss of opportunity. Please.
So you talk about the wonders of the bioindustry and the pharmaceutical industry, and I agree that they are major innovation drivers. And you mentioned this thing about antimicrobial resistance and the need for a new class of antimicrobials. And I totally agree with you. But the pharmaceutical industry doesn't seem interested in investing in a profit-losing industry, which is antimicrobial resistance and development of these antimicrobial drugs. So it confuses me that a lot of members of the pharmaceutical industry and the bioindustry are arguing in the favor of we need new drugs when they are reluctant to invest in the very new drugs that we need to combat AMR. I'm wondering what sort of solutions that you propose to this, because clearly, you don't want to lose profit.
So, some solutions, if I've 1 minute to please. Oh.
Darwin. Now I work at the Japanese pharma company called Shonogi. And our focus is to combat AMR. We spend a lot of money. In fact, actually, infectious disease area is our core therapeutic area. And so please do not say that there's no pharmaceutical companies that are investing a lot of resources on fight against AMR. We are doing it.
So, thank you. The truth is there are a cohort of business models who are trying different things in this space. One of the things you get with the market economy is vibrancy between some people who want to do it this way, other people who want to do it that way. We have a vibrant cohort in the UK of companies that are doing that. It's difficult for them. There are things like de-linked models which are being investigated. There are pull incentives in the market which you can put in, which follow things like incentives that have worked for rare disease in the past, which may be the way through. And I'm happy probably to discuss that one later in detail with you. It takes a range of things to do this. It's not been proven that just investing money in public sector science has delivered antimicrobials either. I think you need a combination of both to make it happen. I think I'm probably going to end with my final point that the UK, I believe, is the epicenter of this really important scientific moment. And I put the center, where do I make the center in the world for this revolution that I think is very, very important? Cambridge! It is nearly Cambridge. It is platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station, because that is where the magical journey starts. And why does the magical journey start there? It is because on one side of the station you have the Francis Crick Institute, the largest biomedical research centre in Europe. On the other side of the station you have Google DeepMind. What is going to make the difference? Creative combination, Harry Potter-like, of bright young things, many of them who may be here tonight, of the big data that's going to come out of DeepMind and the analytical tools from that, with the understanding of the basic science of the future of our bodies from Crick. Put that together, we can really make a difference. Vote for the motion.
Thank you, Steve. We'll now move to our final speaker of this evening, Jack Scannell, who is an investment analyst at UBS in London.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. It's a real pleasure to be invited. And I may be mischaracterizing my illustrious colleagues, but I would say, from what they've said, I would guess they were hard no-drugsiteers. Right? I would regard myself as a slightly softer no-drugsiteer. I'd also say that there's lots of comments about the kind of money-grubbing drug industry. If you want to blame the money-grubbing drug industry, you need to understand people like me. Right? So people like me are involved in deploying, for example, people's pension money, and we want returns. I'm going to talk a bit more about economics in a moment. But before I do, it's been a heavy evening so far, so I think we just want a bit of an imaginative gameplay, and the function of this imaginative gameplay will become clear later. I would like you to imagine these 3 seats here as the good ship Pequod, a whaling ship, which went in search of Moby Dick, the great white whale. And I would like you to imagine my 3 illustrious opponents as characters on that boat. Steve perhaps could be Mr. Starbuck, who after whaling went on to a great career as a coffee franchise expert. Baroness Morgan, I think of as a muscular harpoonist from the South Seas. It's difficult with Captain Ahab, I think, to call any of my opponents Captain Ahab. The psychopathic and monomaniacal captain would be downright libelous. So, therefore, I'd like you to think of Pascal Soireau as Captain Ahab. Okay, so just hold that vision in your minds while I get into the economics. All of the things that everyone who does drug discovery says are important for drug discovery have over the last 50 years become hundreds, thousands, or in some cases tens of billions of times cheaper. It is 10 billion times cheaper now to sequence DNA than it was in 1970. Chemists now can make thousands more molecules per month than they could in the 1960s. We have computers that mean you don't even have to do wet chemistry. You can test your compounds in silico against the drug targets that you've derived from your incredibly cheap genome sequencing. We've got transgenic animals on which to test our new drugs to make human models of disease. Boy, oh boy, drug discovery should be cheap and easy given those huge increases in input efficiency that everyone engaged in both academic and biomedical and commercial drug discovery think are important. But from where I look, which is as an investment analyst, I'm struck by the fact that the drug industry now spends roughly 100 times more on R&D in inflation-adjusted terms than it did in 1950 per drug that it discovers. I find that surprising, and I'm surprised that people like the Wellcome Trust and Medical Research Council don't put more money behind that paradox. But I decided to go and look for a similar paradox in other industries. And first of all, I thought, well, maybe the oil industry looks like that. You suck the oil out of the ground, you get the cheap and easy stuff, so oil gets more expensive over time. In fact, that's not the case. Technological improvements in oil mean that the technology has kept pace with the difficulty of oil discovery, and actually oil is cheaper now in real terms than it was 100 years ago. But I did find one industry, back to the Pequod, it's the whaling industry. The whaling industry between 1855 and 1895 showed a similar, although much less spectacular trend in terms of input and output efficiencies. Merchant shipping became roughly 4 times more efficient. You could sail a ton of cargo or a ton of ship 4 times further per pound of fuel. At the same time, whalebone became roughly 4 times as expensive, right? So roughly 16-fold if you multiply the two, compared to the 100 times more expensive drugs have become to discover and commercialize versus the hundreds, thousands, millions, or in some cases of trillions of times more efficient that the inputs have become. Now, there are 2 broad classes of explanation for this contrast. One is that we just run out of stuff to discover. That was the problem the whaling industry had, right? They killed all the whales. So it's not clear to me what the stuff we've run out of is, but that's one logical explanation. The other logical explanation is that in 1950 and 1960, people were engaged in a bunch of activities that were highly productive, and since then, we've automated and systematized and become hugely efficient at activities that are entirely wrong. Right? And the problem for anyone working in both academic and commercial drug discovery is that the more you disagree with one of those arguments, the more you're forced to agree with the other. So if you think there's lots of fantastic therapeutic opportunities to go for, you must conclude that the vast majority of people now employed at Cambridge University engaged in biomedical research are wasting their time. Or, if you think they're all doing the right thing, then you're forced to conclude that we've got this catastrophic resource depletion problem. So, whatever the answer is, the cost of drug discovery makes people like me suspect, not everyone like me, but a lot of people like me suspect that the average drug company, and Astra at the moment doesn't look average, but the average drug company is probably losing money on R&D. Why does that matter? It matters because 60% of global biomedical research spending comes from the commercial sector. And if people like me think it's not going to make money, we gradually stop the companies spending that money and we spend it on something else that is going to make money, right? And I think as a social objective, that's not necessarily a good thing. So there's a real problem if people like me think the drug industry isn't making money on R&D. And we've got a real paradox here. I look at drug at R&D and I think, boy, oh boy, it's not profitable enough. They're not selling their drugs for enough. And my colleagues are looking at those drugs and saying, boy, oh boy, they're too expensive. And when you've got an industry when its investors are unhappy and when its customers are unhappy, that's not a recipe for success.
I think the motion is this House needs new drugs.
I'm coming on to that.
This House needs a more economically efficient drug.
Okay, so
It doesn't say that analysts need to make more money. It says this House needs more drugs. Please can you say, when you're talking about this House, whether you're talking about patients, right? You're talking about future patients, you're talking about the economy, you're talking about
I do intend to say things that I hope will address your question. So far, I think what I've said, as you may have picked up on, sounds pessimistic, right? But I don't think it has to be. And again, I think the whaling industry is an analogy. People didn't really need whale oil. They thought they needed whale oil, but what they needed is they needed light and they needed lubrication for machines, and that's what whale oil gave them. And I think it's the same with drugs. Actually, drugs give us lots of things we like, but actually what we really are interested in, we're interested in health, we're interested in longevity, we're interested in therapeutic innovation. And I think that the debate around health, longevity, and therapeutic innovation is unduly skewed towards pharmaceuticals. And I think that follows from an accident of intellectual property law. I have briefly, during my career worked for a biotech industry and screened compounds to look for therapeutic opportunities. And when we found something, the very first question we asked was, can we patent it? And if the answer to that question was no, we didn't care if it would cure cancer, we didn't care if it reduced cardiovascular risk. In the absence of secure IP, there was absolutely no point in making any investment. And the kind of invention that has the most secure intellectual property is a composition of matter patent. That reigns supreme. So effectively, the form of therapeutic innovation that is most investable is pharmaceuticals. And I think that's why pharmaceuticals dominate the debate around therapeutic innovation. So ladies and gentlemen, I think the intellectual property tail is wagging the therapeutic dog, and it's made us equate pharmaceuticals with therapeutic innovation. I think what we need is reform to the intellectual property law, reform to the way things are priced, so that we pay for therapeutic innovation, and we don't simply pay for expensive chemical novelty. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I oppose the motion.
Captain Ahab and Starbucks.
It's a very long and boring book, and I never reached the end.
Thank you very much, Jack, for your speech. That concludes this evening's debate. The way we vote here is by walking through doors. If you would like to side with the proposition, walk through the door on the right that says ayes, and with the opposition on the door on the left that says noes. If you'd like to abstain, walk through the middle, and I will read out the results in the bar shortly. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming, and have a good evening.